For roughly 7 seconds, she screamed for help. Her screams were captured by the CCTV camera outside a house in Werribee, Melbourne. Then they stopped. 10 seconds later, a man reappeared within the camera's view. He was covered in blood, the blood of the woman he had been ordered to stay away from. He dragged her lifeless body toward the rear door. Then he sat beside her and called 000. The woman was 42-year-old Czarina Gatbonton Tumaliuan. The man was her estranged husband, Jessie James Tumaliuan. And what made those 10 seconds even more disturbing was what had happened before them. Czarina had already reported him to police. She had obtained intervention orders to keep him away. He had breached those orders, he had gone to prison, he had been released just weeks before, and on the morning of March 27, 2025, while he was out on bail, he returned to her home. He waited for her to take their children to school. He waited for her to come back alone. Then he entered. What followed lasted about 10 seconds. But those 10 seconds ended the life of a mother of 4 and exposed a question far bigger than the murder itself. How does a woman who has reported the danger, obtained court protection, and watched the man violating those protections go to prison still end up fighting for her life against him inside her own home? This is the story of Czarina Gatbonton Tumaliuan. Before we get there, if stories like this matter to you, not simply because they are shocking, but because real people and real families are left behind, please consider subscribing to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because Czarina's story did not end in that backyard, it continued in a courtroom, and for her 4 children, it continued in a life without their mother. So let's go back to where it began. Before Czarina Gatbonton Tumaliuan became the victim at the center of a murder case, the people who knew her best called her Toots. She was 42 years old, a mother of 4, and a woman who had built a life for her family in Werribee, in Melbourne's west. But her story with Jessie James Tumaliuan had begun much earlier, in the Philippines. They met there, they married in 2015, and eventually they moved to Australia, where Jessie's career as a marine engineer brought the family to Melbourne. Czarina built a life of her own. She worked for Medibank while also running an online clothing and apparel business, Bellazima Online Shop. But above everything else were her 4 children. She described them as her treasure, pride, joy, and inspiration. On social media, she called herself a working mum, a businesswoman, and a super mum. That picture matters, because by the time Czarina was murdered, she was no longer simply living the life she had once built with Jessie. The marriage had broken down, they had become estranged, and Czarina was trying to move forward with her children and the life she had built around them. But Jessie did not simply disappear from that life. Instead, the years that followed would bring repeated conflict, violence, and court intervention. And Czarina would eventually have to take increasingly serious steps to protect herself and her children. To understand why she did that, we have to go back to the beginning of the breakdown, and to the first signs that the marriage was becoming dangerous. The first intervention came years before the murder. By 2017, Czarina and Jessie James Tumaliuan's relationship had deteriorated to the point that family violence intervention orders were being put in place to protect her. But the orders did not stop him. In 2018, Tumaliuan assaulted his estranged wife again. He received a bond without conviction for the offense. Over the following years, there were further assaults, threats, and breaches. Tumaliuan was repeatedly sent to prison for ignoring the restrictions that were supposed to keep Czarina safe. His final prison term was 180 days. He was released in January 2025. Within weeks, he was back at Czarina's home. Police were called, he was charged, and once again, he was released on bail. By this point, the authorities had a record stretching back years. There had been violence, there had been court orders, there had been repeated breaches, there had been prison sentences, and still, Jessie Tumaliuan was back in the community. By March 27, 2025, a 5-year intervention order was still in place. Czarina had spent years trying to put legal distance between herself and the man who had repeatedly violated it, but that morning, the distance would disappear. And this time, there would be no next intervention order, no next prison sentence, and no next chance for Czarina to try again. Czarina did not simply endure what was happening and hope it would stop. She reported Tumaliuan's breaches to police. She obtained intervention orders. And when those orders were violated, she kept reporting what was happening. She also took precautions inside her own home. Czarina installed security cameras at both the front and rear of the property. Those cameras were intended to help protect her and her children. By early 2025, Czarina had already done what she could through the systems available to her. She had separated from Tumaliuan. She had sought legal protection. She had reported his repeated breaches, and he had already served time in prison. Yet the protection was never absolute. An intervention order could prohibit a man from approaching her, a police report could document a breach, a prison sentence could remove him from the community for a time, but none of those measures could physically stop him from trying again, and that distinction would matter on March 27, 2025. Because the protections Czarina had put in place could document what happened, they could not prevent it. At about 8:45 a.m. on March 27, 2025, Jessie James Tumaliuan arrived near the Retford Close property in Werribee. He did not go straight to the house. He drove past it, parked down the road and waited. Inside the house, Czarina was preparing for another school morning. She took the younger children to Bethany Catholic Primary School, close to their home. The security cameras captured her leaving. They also captured Tumaliuan waiting. He knew she would eventually return, and he waited. When Czarina came back from the school drop-off, Tumaliuan approached the house. He used keys he should not have had and forced his way inside. The man who was legally prohibited from approaching her was now inside her home, and he had been waiting for her to return. Inside, he confronted Czarina. The immediate subject was money. "You complain too much," he said. "Where is your payment? Where is your payment to me?" But the confrontation quickly became more personal. Tumaliuan was angry about the times Czarina had previously sent him to prison. 4 times, 5 times you sent me to jail, he said. Then came the threat, "Your life will end." At another point, he told her he could not forgive her. Czarina tried to get help. She attempted to call 000. The call was disconnected. Then she ran. She moved toward the rear of the property, heading for the sliding door and courtyard. She was trying to get outside, trying to put distance between herself and the man who had entered her home, but Tumaliuan followed, and he was carrying 2 large kitchen knives. The cameras could not see everything that happened in the rear courtyard, but their microphones continued recording. Czarina screamed for help. Her screams lasted approximately 7 seconds, then they stopped. The attack itself lasted roughly 10 seconds. Seconds later, Tumaliuan came back into view of the cameras. He was covered in blood. He dragged Czarina toward the rear door and sat beside her. Then he called 000. When police arrived, he was still there. He had not fled. He was arrested at the scene. The cameras had captured the beginning of the confrontation. The audio had captured the threats, and the final moments of Czarina's life had been recorded from just beyond the camera's view. What happened inside that courtyard would later be established through the physical evidence and post-mortem examination, but there was already one fact that could not be disputed. Czarina had spent years trying to keep Jessie Tumaliuan away from her. On March 27th, he had found his way inside her home, and now she was dead. When police arrived, Jessie James Tumaliuan was still sitting beside her. He did not flee. Instead, he began talking. His words were not simply an admission of what had happened. He spoke about Czarina, about their conflict, and about the system he believed had failed him. At one point, he told police, "I'm the one who brought them here for a better life. What did your system do?" It was a revealing statement. Even after killing his estranged wife, Tumaliuan was still framing the situation through his grievances against Czarina and against the legal system that had repeatedly intervened in their relationship. His anger had already surfaced during the confrontation. He had demanded money from Czarina. He had complained about the times she had sent him to prison. And now, in the aftermath of her death, he was still talking about what he believed had been done to him. Those statements would later matter because prosecutors and the sentencing judge would have to examine something more difficult than simply what Tumaliuan had done. They would have to consider why he had done it. Was the killing about money? Was it about his resentment toward the police and courts? Was it about Czarina's decision to leave him and build a life without him? Or was it some combination of all three? Those questions would eventually become central to the sentencing hearing. But first, there was another question the justice system had to answer. What happens when a man who had repeatedly ignored court orders, served prison time for his offending, and then killed the woman those orders were intended to protect, finally stands before the court? The answer would begin with the charge he faced and the decision he made when the case reached the Supreme Court of Victoria. By the time the case reached court, the evidence against Jessie James Tumaliuan was extensive. The forensic evidence established the violence Czarina had suffered. She had sustained 8 stab wounds to her neck, head, chest, abdomen and arms. The most serious wounds severed a major artery and the jugular vein in the right side of her neck. Her ribs were fractured, her lung was injured, and the resulting blood loss was catastrophic. The 2 kitchen knives were also part of the evidence. Taken together, the CCTV, audio, physical evidence, and Tumaliuan's own conduct, left little room for dispute about his responsibility for Czarina's death. But the case was about to take a different course. Tumaliuan ultimately pleaded guilty to murder. There would be no contested trial in which a jury would determine whether he was responsible. The evidence would no longer have to be tested against an alternative account of the killing. The central question became sentencing. What punishment was appropriate for a man who had killed his estranged wife after years of violence, intervention orders and repeated breaches? That question would bring the entire history between Czarina and Tumaliuan into the Supreme Court of Victoria. For months, the case against Jessie James Tumaliuan was moving toward a murder trial. The trial was scheduled to begin on February 3, 2026, but before that date arrived, Tumaliuan asked the court for a sentence indication. On January 16, 2026, he appeared before Justice Amanda Fox in the Supreme Court of Victoria. The purpose of the hearing was straightforward. Tumaliuan wanted to know what sentence the court would consider if he pleaded guilty, rather than proceeding to trial. Justice Fox indicated that a guilty plea to murder would result in a sentence of up to 26 years imprisonment, with a 20-year non-parole period. The indication did not mean that the sentence had already been imposed. It gave Tumaliuan a clear picture of the consequences of pleading guilty. 3 days later, his barrister returned to court. Tumaliuan had accepted the indication. He wanted to plead guilty. The murder trial, scheduled for February 3, would no longer take place. But the formal plea still had to be entered, and even at this stage, Justice Fox insisted on getting the process right. An interpreter was unavailable. Tumaliuan could speak English, and during the proceedings he even corrected the court when his first name was read incorrectly. But this was a murder charge, and a guilty plea could keep him in prison for decades. Justice Fox therefore refused to proceed with the arraignment without ensuring that he had access to a Filipino interpreter. The formal plea was delayed. When Tumaliuan eventually returned with the interpreter present, the charge was put to him. He answered, "Guilty, Your Honor." 2 words ended the prospect of a contested murder trial, but they did not end the case. A guilty plea established responsibility. It did not determine the punishment. Justice Fox still had to decide what sentence was appropriate. That meant examining the circumstances of the killing, Tumaliuan's history of violence and intervention order breaches, his offending while on bail, his conduct after the murder, his guilty plea, and his personal circumstances. The court would also hear from the people Czarina left behind. Her family would have the opportunity to describe, in their own words, what her death had taken from them. Then the prosecution and defense would make their respective cases on sentence. The prosecution would argue for the punishment the seriousness of the offending demanded. The defense would ask the court to consider the factors that might reduce it, and Justice Amanda Fox would have to weigh all of those arguments before deciding the sentence. The question was no longer whether Jessie James Tumaliuan had killed Czarina. He had admitted that. The question was how many years the law would take from him for taking her life. Once Tumaliuan pleaded guilty, the courtroom was no longer concerned with proving who had killed Czarina. The issue was punishment. How serious was the offending, and what sentence was justified? For the prosecution, the murder could not be separated from the years that preceded it. Tumaliuan had known about the intervention orders. He had breached them repeatedly. He had already served prison time for his offending, and yet, after being released in January 2025, he returned to Czarina's home within weeks. On March 27th, he was on bail. He drove to the property, waited while Czarina took the children to school, and remained there until she returned alone. He then entered the home using a key. Inside, he confronted her about money and threatened her. When Czarina tried to escape through the rear of the property, he followed her carrying knives. She was unarmed. She was attempting to get away, and she was attacked inside the home, where she was entitled to feel safe. The prosecution could therefore point to more than the final act itself. There was the history of violence, the repeated breaches of court orders, the previous imprisonment, the fact that he was on bail, and the circumstances of the killing itself. 8 stab wounds were inflicted across Czarina's body, including the fatal wound to her neck. For the prosecution, those circumstances demonstrated the gravity of the offending. The defense did not attempt to blame Czarina. Tumaliuan's barrister, Chris Hooper, accepted that the couple had separated before the murder and that Tumaliuan had continued attending her home despite that separation. He accepted that Tumaliuan used a key to enter the property that morning. He told the court that his client had gone there intending to confront Czarina verbally about money, but Hooper also accepted what happened after that confrontation. Czarina was unarmed. Tumaliuan had armed himself with a knife. She tried to escape. There were multiple stab wounds, and Hooper made the position of the defense clear. No fault is laid at her feet at all. He also accepted that the attack would have been terrifying for Czarina, and that she was entitled to feel safe in her own home. The defense therefore turned to mitigation. The guilty plea was central. Tumaliuan had accepted responsibility after the sentence indication hearing, avoiding a contested murder trial, but Hooper acknowledged the limitation of that argument. The guilty plea was the only expression of remorse before the court. There was little else. The defense also pointed to Tumaliuan's personal circumstances. He had no diagnosed mental health condition and no identified substance abuse problem, and there was another factor Hooper asked the court to consider: deportation. After serving his sentence, Tumaliuan was expected to be deported to the Philippines. The defense argued that this would make his imprisonment more difficult because he would eventually be separated from the Australian life he had built. But the prosecution and defense had now put their respective positions before Justice Fox. The prosecution had presented a history of repeated violence, ignored orders, escalating offending, and a brutal killing. The defense had accepted the central facts and asked the court to consider the guilty plea, his personal circumstances, and the consequences of deportation. The arguments were now complete. What remained was for Justice Amanda Fox to decide what weight each of those factors deserved, and what sentence the murder ultimately demanded. Justice Amanda Fox now had to weigh the factors advanced on Tumaliuan's behalf against the seriousness of the offending. The first was his guilty plea. Fox gave it weight. It meant Tumaliuan had accepted responsibility for the murder, and that a contested trial would no longer be necessary. But the judge distinguished between accepting guilt and demonstrating remorse. The guilty plea was the only expression of remorse before the court. Beyond it, there was little evidence that Tumaliuan had demonstrated genuine remorse for what he had done. The judge then considered rehabilitation. Could Tumaliuan change? Justice Fox said his prospects were difficult to assess because she had been told very little positive about him. What the court did have was a long history of offending, repeated breaches of intervention orders, and repeated opportunities to stop. He had already been subjected to court orders. He had already served prison time, and he had still returned to Czarina's home. There was also no diagnosed mental health condition or identified illicit substance abuse problem before the court that provided an explanation for his behavior. Then came deportation. Tumaliuan was expected to be deported to the Philippines after serving his sentence. The defense argued that this would make his imprisonment more difficult, but Fox considered where his family connections actually lay. His parents and siblings lived in Manila. His children were in the United States. The judge therefore did not regard his Australian connections as a compelling basis for reducing the sentence, and then she made the point bluntly: whatever life he made here, he decimated when he committed this crime. There was another factor Justice Fox had to weigh: the need for denunciation. This was not simply a murder committed in isolation. Tumaliuan had killed a woman who had already tried to protect herself from him. The circumstances made the need for a sentence that reflected the gravity of the offending particularly important. The guilty plea mattered. So did Tumaliuan's personal circumstances. But neither erased the history that preceded the murder, the circumstances of the attack, or the harm inflicted on Czarina and her family. Justice Fox had now considered the factors capable of reducing the sentence. She had to weigh them against the seriousness of the crime. And the next question was no longer about mitigation, it was about punishment. On June 24, 2026, Jessie James Tumaliuan stood before Justice Amanda Fox in the Supreme Court of Victoria. Justice Fox sentenced him to 26 years in prison with a 20-year non-parole period. By that point, Tumaliuan had already spent 454 days in custody, which would count toward the sentence, but the number on the sentence was only one part of what happened in that courtroom. Justice Fox also spoke about the people who had been left behind. Czarina had been murdered only a short distance from where her children were at school. Her 4 children had lost their mother. The judge described them as left heartbroken, and that was the difference between a sentence and a loss. Tumaliuan's punishment had a number attached to it: 26 years. A 20-year non-parole period. Czarina's children had no equivalent endpoint. The sentence could punish the man responsible. It could formally condemn the murder, but it could not return their mother. The courtroom could close the case. It could not close the absence Czarina left behind. The sentence was 26 years, but Czarina's family did not receive a sentence with an end date. They received a life without her. Her 4 children had gone to school on the morning of March 27, 2025, expecting their mother to be there when they came home. She never came home. Czarina's mother, Maria Gatencio, gave her victim impact statement by video link from the United States. Her daughter was gone. There would be no reconciliation, no second chance, no future in which Czarina could simply walk back through the door and return to the life that had been taken from her. Then Czarina's teenage son spoke. He remembered his mother as his family's supermum. She was the person they turned to when they were frightened or sad. When something went wrong, she was the person they knew they could depend on. That was what the children had lost. Not simply a mother, the person they associated with safety, comfort, and home. Her son described the loss as a space in their hearts that could not be fixed. And that is what a prison sentence cannot measure. Tumaliuan will serve his sentence. The court has imposed its punishment. But Czarina's children will continue living with the absence created by her death. The case can end in a courtroom, the grief cannot. Czarina spent years trying to create distance between herself and the man who repeatedly violated the boundaries placed around her. She sought protection. She reported breaches, she took precautions, and ultimately she was killed inside her own home. Justice Amanda Fox could sentence the man responsible. She could condemn what he had done, but there was one thing the court could never order. It could not give 4 children their mother back. Czarina had reported the violence. The courts had imposed orders. Tumaliuan had been imprisoned for breaching them. And yet, on March 27, 2025, he reached her again. That is the uncomfortable question left behind by her death. Not simply whether the danger was recognized. It was, but whether recognizing danger is enough when the person posing that danger is determined to ignore every boundary placed between him and his victim. A court order can prohibit contact. A police report can document a threat. A security camera can record what happens. But none of them can physically stand between a determined attacker and the person he intends to reach. Czarina's death leaves no simple answer to that problem. It leaves something harder, the knowledge that recognizing danger and physically preventing it are not always the same thing.